Well, I just came off a wonderful podcast with the amazing Dr. Jack Cruz. I've been dying to get him on for ages, and I thought I'd add this little intro video. We had a wonderful conversation, not such deep science as he gets into on some of the other podcasts, because I'm not really of a scientific mind, but we did get into some. And honestly, Jack has such amazing way of lateral thinking and thinking right outside the box, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I didn't mean it to be so much about my family, but he was very generous with his time on that, and I'm sure a lot of the stuff can be, can relate to absolutely everybody, really. And I wanted to give a bit of an insight into, well, for the carnivore community, really, that it's not all about food. There's a lot of other aspects to look at, and Jack has nailed it with all the light and the sun and how this affects us. And what's so beautiful is the way that he looks at nature and tries to bring that home in a scientific way, instead of just making up some kind of a theory and chasing it, with funding from the big corporations. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it. It's been very, very enjoyable for me to get Jack on again and to see him after so many years. Last time I saw him. And yeah, if you enjoy the podcast, please check out the other episodes. Please donate if you like, to help me keep it going. So there'll be a donate button down there. And do check out our Big Fat Challenge at thebigfatchallenge.com that I'm running with Ben Hunt. And we can hopefully translate into simple forms what to do with a lot of Jack's knowledge, because a lot of my inspiration has come from his work. So yeah, check that out, and see you on the next episode. Hope you enjoy this one coming up, though. It was great.
Son of a lighthouse keeper, through cons and a wishing well, prayed for a love to call his own, a love to break the spell.
Welcome to the Red Pill Buddhas podcast, for red-pilled Buddhas everywhere. Revolutionary, free-thinking spiritual people who've woken up from the mainstream narrative on various levels, and I interview some of the most fascinating ones here. Please also visit thehumanunleashed.com for hundreds of hours of our video content on all areas of health, lifestyle, and much more, and the redpillrevolution.com for our 5-star reviewed book and subsequent publications in the Red Pill series as they come out. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Red Pill Buddhas podcast. I haven't done one for a while, for reasons which we might come into later, and I thought I'd come back with a bang. I'm so honored to have Dr. Jack Cruz on here. Uncle Jack. Jack's website and Jack's blogs probably saved my life back in 2011, 2012. And I got so into the knowledge. It was marvelous. And I was really honored when Jack did the foreword to my Arthritis Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me book. I thought that was wonderful, and got to meet Jack and hang out with him in 2016. I can't believe how long ago it was. Jack, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, no problem. Anytime.
One thing I'd like to do to start, will you do me a little favor? I was hoping the kids were going to be here when we actually hooked up in the end, but will you just give have a little go at my kids and me, probably, and any time in this interview, give me a good spanking if you want. I can take it. I'm good with that. But just give them a little message of not moaning when we say get off your screens and get your beautiful mixed race skin out into the sun whenever it comes out. Tell them, Jack.
Yeah, I mean, well, the thing is, for people to take the message that we really don't need to be on food diets, we need to be on tech diets, you need to understand why that point is being made. And if you don't understand why, generally you don't get the follow through. I kind of tell people ideation without execution leads to deletion of every good idea. So you can hear a lot of great ideas on Twitter or social media or either the television or whatever. But if you don't understand where it comes from, you're never going to do it. So the big problem for us is we are designed to use sunlight in order to run our physiology. And not to get too deep into the weeds with the science already, but the key for mammals is this protein called melanin. And melanin is linked to the story that you learned about 11, 12 years ago. It's called the leptin melanocortin pathway. And that melano part in the middle, the melanin part, is the key. It's a giant solar panel that is in our skin to varying degrees. You have less of it and you have special kinds compared to your children, because your children obviously are mixed race. They have more melanin than you. And it turns out they're able to handle sunlight better than you are. The problem is you and your wife live at the 51st, 52nd latitude. And that's not the ideal place for them or for you. So one of the things that people, I think, don't know is when you have a lot of melanin in your skin and you're sitting on a device like we are right now talking, it raises your blood glucose. Most people have been completely unaware of part of the reason why I'm a little bit controversial on the internet, because I tell people what you eat doesn't matter as much as the light that you live around. And it has to do with this melanin story. There's a gene in us called POMC, stands for pro-opiomelanocortin. Basically it's a big protein that is cleaved 6 different ways by light frequencies. And it turns out mammals happen to be the one animal on the planet that can actually make glucose directly from sunlight. So when you hear that, you're like, whoa, wait a minute, that makes us a little bit different. But here's the key point, Phil, to bring it home, is when you make blood sugar or glucose from blue light that is emitted by tech screens, it turns off your ability to create melanin in your body or renovate the melanin that you have. So what does that mean? It usually makes your skin atrophy, or melanin in other places in your body, like inside your brain where melanin is. Most people know that melanin is in a place inside your head that's related to a disease like Parkinson's disease, called the substantia nigra. Another place that's located is inside your eye, called the retinal pigmentum epithelium. Those are the common places. Like when you open up a book and you're not a doctor, you're like, okay. The key problem, Phil, is people don't understand what that physically means down the road. Like, what's the collateral mistake? What is the train wreck at the end of the story? In your case, you happen to know your train wreck. You developed rheumatoid arthritis, a long time ago, but you had no earthly idea of how this story of light, POMC, and melanin were tied to this whole story. And since we've been friends for 10 years, I've told you, I want your skinny little ass to get out and get south. And, when I found out that you married a dark-skinned woman and you have children, I really stepped on your dick, to kind of get you to understand that living in the UK is a huge mismatch. Like, your skin has adapted to it because you've been able to take the melanin out of your skin and suck it inside into your brain. That's what mammals do. The reason why, melanocytes are neuroectodermal tissues, meaning that they still have neuroplasticity, so they can move. And it turns out the things that people don't realize is, what's the stimulus for the melanocytes not to move? It's actually UV light. And that is the key. That's the key frequency that where you live is, I don't want to say it's absent, because that's not true. It's still present at different times of the year, but there's a paucity of that frequency around. And it turns out Phil, you can navigate this decently, but your kids and your wife, not so much. And they're going to struggle at that high latitude down the road every time.
Jack, you were right. You were absolutely right. She ended up with Graves' disease.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And see,
she's doing very well now, but she was in a mess beginning of 2019.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to hear that, but I want you to understand that every time the kids put the iPhone, the iPad, the computer in front of them, they're making it more likely that they get another collateral effect like your wife's got. And my whole goal, instead of being the shit stirrer on the internet between, the food gurus and the light gurus, is for people to understand why this happens. And mammals are different than every other animal on this planet. That's the key thing that people don't realize. And I think human mammals somehow think because they have two frontal lobes, that makes them far superior to the rest of the mammals on this planet, and that they're not subject to the laws of nature. And that turns out to be the stupidest possible idea that you can have. Why? Because it turns out this Ferrari engine puts you at the biggest risk as a mammal. See, those furry little creatures that don't have well-developed brains, they can navigate, an alien environment for light like we've created with Microsoft and Apple products. We can't. And if you don't believe me, I know in the UK, you can look to see what's happened just to general society in the last 25 years to notice there's a big change. You and I are old enough to know about that change. The same thing is happening here. The interesting thing is most people who will listen to this have never really connected why certain things are happening. So since we're talking about your kids, I'm going to not parse my words. I'm going to just vomit it out. When you put a young child in front of a tech screen, you basically create a situation where their insulin levels and their blood glucose goes up. And both of those things happen without any food. Okay. And it's tied to this POMC gene. The POMC gene creates these 7 different peptides. It's not important about how the peptides work, but I will tell you, because I know you're a big believer in the food stuff with the carnivore diet and with glucose and carbohydrates, and you being a former vegan. I know your backstory, but I want the listeners and you to understand this. 2 of the cleaved products from POMC. Number 1 is ACTH. Most people know that's adrenocorticotropin releasing hormone. That hormone actually increases cortisol. Cortisol is a gluconeogenic protein, so it makes glucose. That's how mammals actually make glucose from light. So we do have animal photosynthesis in us just from blue light exposure. The second big one that most people don't know about is another protein that's cleaved from POMC. It's called CLIP. CLIP, again, not important, but what does it do? It's an insulin secretog. So hard stop, realize no food in the mouth, you raise your insulin level and your blood glucose up every time you look at a text screen. When you understand that, then you begin to understand how the game changes, for you and your biology. I mean, now, if you happen to eat a cheesecake or drink amaretto coffee, and you're at the 51st latitude, I mean, this is an additive effect that actually will affect this leptin melanocortin pathway. And the big effect for people with melanin in different parts of their body is it degrades your melanin solar panels. In other words, your skin becomes more atrophic. What does that mean? It means when you go in the sun, when it comes out at Hyde Park in London and Phil takes his clothes off and gets into his Kaneki, he gets red really fast and may even get, blisters. In your kid's case, your wife's case, even when she goes out in the Kaneki, she may not be able to absorb the UV light that's actually physically present. So this is a really big problem because, we tell people to go out in the sun, but if you go out in the sun and you have an atrophic solar panel, what good is really going out in the sun? You actually have to explain to people how you make the sun useful. And because of this unique gene in mammals, you have to understand how to fine tune and tie it up. So the short answer for your children is stay away from tech screens, because what does it do? It turns off this POMC gene. And it turns out the POMC gene, the number one thing that it makes that's good for us is melanin through a chemical called alpha MSH. And alpha MSH is actually what is the difference between you and the rest of your family. Turns out that they have more alpha MSH production in you or in them than you do. Your clade of people migrated out of the East African Rift, probably 70,000 years ago to get to the 51st latitude. And the reason why there's a change in your skin, this goes back now to the basic biophysics, is there was a loss of UV light from, say, 6 degrees north latitude up to 52. What did that do? How did you lose your color that they have? With no UV light, the stimulus was for those melanocytes via neuroplasticity to get sucked inside your brain. And when it gets sucked inside your brain, there's actually a reason for that. This is not magic. It's neuroplasticity of those melanocytes. You have to realize for your family right now, the reason why this Graves' disease that you just told me about is a big deal, the reverse is happening to your family. Without UV light, the stuff that's inside them that actually made them human is now getting sucked out to their surface because there's no UV light. When you physically understand this and understand that tech screens make this worse, why, Phil? Because you know this, I taught you this a long time ago. Tech screens provide no UV stimulus. They provide no infrared A stimulus. And it turns out that those two lights in the spectrum of light that we see on the Pink Floyd album cover are the two key lights that mammals need to do well. In other words, to thrive. And if we could magically bring infrared A and UVA and UVB light back to the UK for, say, 8 or 9 months out of the year, then I wouldn't worry too much about your wife and your kids. But I do worry about it. Why? Because you're a pale white guy who comes from that part of the world, and it even clipped you in the ass by you getting rheumatoid arthritis. So now your wife has got an autoimmune thyroid condition, which, again, the thyroid on this path that we're talking about, it's called the retinohypothalamic pathway. Light comes in through the eye, gets to the pituitary. The pituitary is where thyroid stimulating hormone works. This whole pathway is mediated by the retinal pigmentum epithelium. So if I was able to look in your wife's eye, through the internet, which obviously I can't do with my ophthalmoscope, I would notice on her eye, right outside her fovea, she would have a machine gun effect of lesions all across her RPE. And just so you know, Phil, and the reason I'm telling you this is this is where the somatotopic organization of the retina then projects into the pituitary that causes the Graves' disease. Why? Because these POMC neurons not only are in the eye, but they project. It's like a target, a gun and a target in the pituitary. And what do? They affect those POMC neurons in the hypothalamus, in the pituitary stalk, that deal with TSH. And she is making too many antibodies in the TSH area that are destroying that thyroid axis. And how this whole thing goes, and this is probably the most important part for you and her to understand, the two amino acids that are important in this pathway are tyrosine and phenylalanine. Why? Those two aromatic amino acids are turned on and programmed by UV light, and they're changed. They're changed in two ways. Again, we're getting deep into the weeds here, but we have to add 4 electrons to each one of those to hydroxylate them, to get them to turn into T3 and T4. so that they're normal. And for your listeners who don't know, T3 and T4 are the two hormones made by the thyroid gland. A lot of people are surprised to learn that tyrosine, which is the base chemical that eventually becomes melanin, or T3 and T4, or dopamine, are involved in this whole pathway. And it turns out, as light comes through your pupil, these are all the targets on the way to the midbrain that have to be hit and programmed in this pathway. It's almost like, if you think about it, it's like a train station, and where your wife's car crash occurred is right in the middle of this pathway, at the pituitary stalk. And that's what caused her disease. The reason I worry about the Graves' disease now that you've told me about it, I know what the collateral effects are going to be for her 5, 10, 15 years down the road, because it's going to destroy the melanin distal to that. And now that we're talking about it, I know you're in the UK and you use the NHS. Can you and your wife find some information that Uncle Jack might be right about this whole pathway tied to her Graves' disease? The answer is yeah. It's called the OCT. It's actually a CT scan that's done optically of her retina. And what you'll notice in that area, when you do it, it actually shows you the different levels of the retina. You'll notice that Bruch's membrane and the retinal pigmentum epithelium, in a very specific area of it, she'll have damage. And that damage is what shoots the light to the area in her brain where TSH is created and T3 and T4 is created. It affects all these pathways. And the things that do all these things, they're not the fancy biochemistry that, Bart K likes to tell you. These are actually biophysical changes that occur that create these changes. With understanding biochemistry without biophysics is kind of like Phil going to the music store and buying Prince's guitar and thinking because he bought Prince's guitar, he can play guitar like Prince. It's a fucking joke, okay? And it's the reason why, Phil, that I have a huge problem with food gurus, because they separate this out. And when you understand fundamentally where food comes from, food is a light story. I've always told you this because it comes from photosynthesis. There's not one food on this planet, unless it's man-made, that doesn't come from photosynthesis. So in that sense, food for us is like an electromagnetic barcode that our mitochondria has to decipher. Same thing is true with this pathway that we're leading, with your wife. And this is really important, probably for you kids to understand when they get bigger. Why? Because if mama got this problem, and remember, mama gave those babies the engine, and they keep standing in front of the Apple iPad and the TV and the cell phones, it means that those kids are going to get a problem in that retinal hypothalamic pathway, or one of the targets, distal, sooner than your wife did. Why? Because that's called transgenerational epigenetics, meaning that because the mitochondrial engine is passed from mom to baby, Phil has nothing to do with this, that light programs changes in the genes, meaning RNA and DNA is changed by that quicker. Why are we built like that? We're built like that so we can adapt to new environments. That's the reason why your children and your wife are able to even survive for as long as they can survive at the 50-second latitude when they're not designed to be there. They're designed to be in a tropical environment because their systems need more light to work properly than yours does. Why? That's why you're a pale guy, because you can handle a low UV environment. That's why your mitochondria uncoupled. I'd be willing to bet you, if you checked your kids out and your wife out with a 23andMe test or, ancestry.com, that their mitochondrial haplotype is radically different than yours, and they're probably more tightly coupled. That also has implications for the things they do. It also has implications for how the doctor should understand her Graves' disease, because Graves' disease in an African descent person has to be treated differently than, say, if you developed it, in the UK. Why? Because of the coupling mechanism in the mitochondria. And this is the difference between centralized medicine, which is what you find with the NHS, and a guy like me. I'm a decentralized guy. What does decentralized mean? That there's no single controller in the way that I look at biology. For me, light and dark, that is the ring of life. You have to realize that everything in biology is a coupled system. Now, in biology, the coupled systems are very, very complex, as you know. But the problem is on the centralized side, they look at Graves' disease. Oh, well, her T cells are just making a lot of antibodies that are affecting this axis. And basically what we just need to do is this, and we'll give her this prescription. That's not how this works. Or they try to use radioactive iodine to destroy her gland and try to fix this. I mean, when you think about how they remedy the Graves' disease, it almost makes you want to pull your hair out.
Barbaric. I mean, barbaric. Either cut it out or radioactive iodine. It's just, she resisted all of that.
Correct. And I mean, it's just, I understand the issue with it, but I spend my time doing podcasts like this, trying to educate the public that you have a doctor inside of you that's decentralized. If you would just get your own frontal lobes out of your own way and realize that your light environment really is what got you in this mess, and your light environment can get you out of this mess, that's probably the best way to deal with it. But unfortunately, as you know, Phil, it's really hard to teach people who you love the truth. You know, they're addicted to this technology. People don't realize when your blood glucose is up and your insulin levels are up because of the blue light toxicity, it's the same factor that casinos use against you to put their hand in your pocket without putting the hand in the pocket. It lowers your dopamine level. Again, most people don't realize this dopamine story is actually tied to the melanin story. Why? Because L-Dopa, which is made from tyrosine and phenylalanine, actually forms both melanin, but it forms dopamine. It forms noradrenaline. Turns out dopamine and noradrenaline are the two major neurotransmitters that are used in the frontal lobe, which separates us from chimps. Remember, chimps look the way they do because they don't have frontal lobes. They have a flat face. We have the frontal lobes that sit above that. And those are new real estate territories that are predominantly built around tyrosine and phenylalanine with UV light. Without those things, humans don't get that problem. And it turns out the melanin that sits in your pituitary, your midbrain, and your thalamus is actually what fires that. The ultimate target of all that melanin in that pathway is your frontal lobes. And we call those in neurosurgery and neurobiology the reward pathways. That's where you'll hear a lot of people in the food guru world talk about reward pathways and things like that. There's a lot of other issues, a lot of other social issues that are linked to the story. And what I tried to hit with you earlier, so if you put a kid in front of these screens, the number one thing that happens to them is that they sexually mature faster. They get precocious puberty. And we're beginning to see this. Like, I never saw this in the beginning of my medical career. We're now having kids come in with their periods at 6 years old.
Yeah.
And
I've seen this. I've seen this in my daughter's school, and it's amazing. Yeah. Well, it's very sad.
Believe it or not, 65 million years ago, mammals used this to survive. The problem is now it's the reverse. Now we're beginning to see the problems because, remember, unlike the mammals that survived the KT event, that were small little furry creatures underneath the ground who had small brains, we're now big mammals that live above the ground with huge territories in our head. And this puts us at a thermodynamic disadvantage. So when this happens, this whole pathway, everything that controls our frontal lobe biology is gone. So magically, you'll have guys like Lustig and Barkay go out and tell you, oh, well, glucose is addictive. That's kind of not really true. It's actually this pathway gone awry. And when you understand how the pathway goes awry, which I will tell you, I don't believe most people do. I believe I've gotten it down pretty well and can explain to people how these things happen. But ultimately, the number one thing that happens is when blood glucose and insulin goes up, this gene in you, the POMC gene, becomes a problem. Why? Because your melanin sheets don't work. What does that mean? You effectively turn off your ability to use the sun. That is a huge problem.
Jack, I've got to come in on that one because it's a brilliant point. I listened to one of your POMC podcasts and it absolutely fascinated me. Now, I hate interrupting you and because I love it when you just go and tie everything in. So I'm going to roll a few questions into one here because I think you'll sort of see the connection between them. You know, as far as the food guru thing goes, I totally take it. I mean, you've said to me, will you become a light guru and stop being a food guru? I mean, the only reason I go on about food, I guess, is because there's so many misconceptions about it. And there's a war on meat now, and it's, you know, but when I ever do a consult with somebody, believe me, it's like the food's easy. Let's get that out of the way. Right now, let's get the light sorted. Let's even get the emotional stuff sorted. Let's get you chilled out. I want to come on to consciousness and the monk who sold his Ferrari a little bit later. But, you know, this was such an interesting thing for me, the melanin thing. And I think I've made some connections. I mean, I wore contact lenses and wore shades, you know, for about 30 odd years. During that time, when I was a kid, I used to go beautifully brown in the sun. You know, we used to go to Aqaba in Jordan a lot. I didn't care about the sun. I never wore sunscreen. You know, people weren't slathering their kids in it in those days. It was wonderful. And then the more as the years went on, the less I could tolerate the sun. I think...
Now you know the reason why.
Yeah, but I think I probably made a hideous mistake in 2006, which was to get my eyes lasered. And so I did that. Great, you get the sight. You don't have to muck about with all that crap. But now I do think that the light going in, and I'm coming to the point. A lot of people have asked me recently about this since your podcast. Actually, a lot of our members on our Big Fat Challenge group have asked me about, you know, a couple of them have had cataract surgery and a couple of them have had their eyes lasered and whatever. And I wonder how much I'm struggling uphill because, you know, last summer, I messed about last summer. I was living a rock and roll lifestyle. I was in that band, the Daz band as well, that did the, you can shove the New World Order up your ass, you can shove your poison vaccines up your ass and all that. We were doing festivals. I was playing other gigs with other bands, drinking too much brandy, mucking about. And I got really sick, really sick last October, November, December. The joints came up just like they were. I thought, I'm healed. I'm invincible. I can muck about now. I was in real trouble. I lost 45 pounds, you know, and I wasn't fat to start with. And I got in real trouble. I got out of it now. I'm cool. I'm all right. I'm fine. Putting the weight back on and whatever. But it was a kind of a shocker. And I sort of think how much when people have had the eyes messed about with, they're struggling against that. And now, you know, since the carnivore diet is pretty cool for some things and did a load of other things. And now I love the sun instead of shying away from it, feeling like a vampire. But I can't take much and I don't go brown like I did as a kid. The last part of the question is, when people have had these surgical interventions and lasering and cataracts and things like that, and even foreign objects in the body. Now, I'm just going to share my screen for a second and you'll see, can you see that?
Yeah.
Right. That.
Whose neck is that?
That neck belongs to my son, who's 33, who lives in Bali.
That's not good.
No. Now, he's had that since he was about 12 years old. He had an aneurysmal bone cyst.
Oh, okay. That
He
makes me
is.
feel better. I thought maybe he broke his neck.
No. We brought him up veggie and then I fed him a load of crap and we didn't live that well. And by 12, he had this aneurysmal bone cyst. And so he had that done in his neck. Now he lives in Bali. He's actually really bright. He understands your stuff better than I do. He's brilliant. But even with a ton of sun, he's having a load of trouble.
He's done it because he needs way more sun
Right. So that's the end of the question. Like, what happens with people who've had their eyes lasered, cataracts, things put into their body? You know, is this still affecting him, that kind of thing, or anybody else with stuff like that? That's my questions rolled into one.
Leave the picture up. I don't know when you let this podcast go live that the audience will be able to see this picture, but I hope they can, because I want you to leave it up. So let me explain to you the two different parts, because this is really important for you to hear. The eye surgery that you're talking about, when the cataract surgeon or the LASIK surgeon goes in, they're using a laser to resurface the cornea, especially with laser surgery. Generally, most people don't have a problem with that, but here's the caveat. We have an opsin on our eye called neuropsin. It's a UVA light detector. That light detector is really important for what happens on the RPE and Bruch's membrane. If the connection between that neuropsin and the RPE are damaged, that damages the retinal hypothalamic tract. That's, remember I told you the gun that shoots the target to things distal, meaning your pituitary and down into your brain. The end part of this retinal hypothalamic tract, it's a diencephalon derivative. Anything you hear with the word thalamus in the brain is a target of the retina, okay? And it turns out that the retinal hypothalamic tract also goes to another part of the thalamus called the habenular nucleus. There's now reports out there, Phil, that after LASIK surgery that you can become wildly depressed in 2 weeks and kill yourself.
Yeah.
In fact, we have a very famous,
you say that.
Yeah, we have a very famous story in the United States of a meteorologist who worked in Detroit. It was, publicized big time here, where she had laser surgery because she always worked in the blue light, so she could get rid of her glasses. She did that, and within 2 weeks of having the laser surgery, she killed herself, and she had 4 kids. And nobody could figure it out because it wasn't, part of her modus operandi. Well, back when this happened, nobody knew that the target of the retinal hypothalamic tract, which everybody knew in the neurosurgery books, was the SCN, which is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the circadian clock mechanism. But these retinal ganglion cells also target the habenular nucleus. They also target other things that we now know. So in other words, we now have the neural pathway to explain what happened to her. The problem becomes for the ophthalmologist when they do this surgery on your surface of your cornea, because neuropsin is on your cornea and on your skin. If they damage the neuropsin, remember, when they're doing the surgery, there's no blinking red light. Oh, this is neuropsin here. Don't put your laser there. There's no way to mark where the neuropsin is on your cornea. So if it's damaged, because they have to cut the laser to get the refractive correction so you can see, then you're fucked, okay? But if it doesn't damage neuropsin, you're not going to have a problem, okay? It's almost kind of like playing the lottery. You really don't know. So my belief is, until ophthalmology realizes that they need to come up with a dye to figure out where neuropsin is, where they can make safe cuts with the laser, you should stick with your glasses. You should not look for a laser corrective surgery. Now, getting to this x-ray, what's the part of the story? If you were with me right now and we had the ability to look at an MRI, I would show you, and I do this with my patients, in front of this plate that your son has, where that metal cage right here, like I'm touching this right now, where the metal plate sits in the front of the spine, there is a ligament called the anterior longitudinal ligament. If you follow that all the way up, Phil, to where you see that little P on the top of his spine, where it meets the skull, and go a little bit further, it goes all the way up to the surface of the skull, right where the pituitary is. In other words, light comes through your eye, it actually is turned into a DC electric current along that ligament that goes all the way down your spine to your ass. That ligament is on the front of your spine and the back of your spine, but in front of your spinal cord. You look at your son's picture, you'll see the screws going in the back. The screws going in the back are through what we call the lamina and the facets. Okay. The spinal cord sits right in that little area between the screws and the cage in the front. But right behind that cage is the posterior longitudinal ligament. What do the anterior longitudinal ligament and posterior longitudinal ligament do? They are, I want you to think about them just like copper wires that go all the way down your spine that create the DC electric current at every level. So when you put titanium in that area, which unfortunately Uncle Jack does, in fact, got to go see a couple of patients who've had this because they broke their neck later today. It changes the piezoelectric current. What does piezoelectric means? It means when bone or ligaments are stressed, they release an electric flow. That electric flow distal is diminished. So when your son has probably gone back to the ortho or the neurosurgeon that did this, they're going to tell him that he can get what they call juxtafusional failure, meaning levels below or above degenerate at a faster rate. In centralized orthopedics, centralized neurosurgery, most of them do not accept what I'm going to tell you. Why? Because most of them don't understand how the system works. Is when you interrupt the DC electric current, things degenerate faster. You know where that idea comes from. It comes from the work of Robert O. Becker, who, again, was an orthopedic surgeon in the United States who figured a lot of this basic circuitry out a long time ago in the 60s about bone. Most orthopedic and neurosurgeons still to this day don't realize bone doesn't heal. Let me say that again. Bone doesn't heal. Bone regenerates. This is the one part of mammals that still has the ability to regenerate. Like we can do it in our liver and we can do it in our bone, but it always stuns medical students, orthopedics, when I tell them this, because they've never gone back and read the original work of what Becker studied. And he found out that you need to have a DC electric current to actually take one of the red blood cells that comes from bone injury, and it de-differentiates into bone cells to actually regenerate stem cells completely. That's the reason why when you see a bone that's damaged, it has no scar in it. Like every single orthopedic surgeon who's going to listen to this will know that when you go in and see it, you break your femur and it heals completely without any problems. If you go back in, say, because you broke it in another area later, if you go back to the original area, it's completely pristine. There's no scar. It's not like what happens on your skin or happens anywhere else. Many people don't know what I just told you. They actually think, I didn't know that. Well, we've known that from the 60s. The problem is centralized medicine still doesn't understand it, but it's operational in your son's case. Why? Because obviously he needed to have this done. But what it does is it sets him up for problems above and below this fusion down the road. So if you told me, well, my son's having problems with his thoracic or lumbar spine now, wouldn't shock Uncle Jack at all. If your son's having problems above the fusion based on where the screws are, because it affects the posterior column, wouldn't shock Uncle Jack either. I mean, I would expect those type of problems. The big issue is what I would tell him to do as a decentralized spine surgeon versus a centralized one are likely going to be radically different. In his case, he needs way more UV light, way more infrared A light. Why? Because he's lost that piezoelectric ability. So that means he needs to irradiate his body below the level of diffusion and above the level of diffusion to offset the interruption. Because effectively what this hardware does to him, it's like cutting the wire, that doesn't work. So there's not a complete connection in the system like it was when he was born. Okay, that's the key. And one of the interesting things that you'll find is when you can get people that have a cervical fusion to tan below the level of their injury, they tend not to have juxtafusional failure. That's something that I figured out over the last 20 years of looking at this stuff. I didn't know that I could have a huge effect in helping my patients until about 10 years ago, when I began to realize that just because they had a cervical fusion or a disc replacement meant they were fucked for the rest of their life. No, it was incumbent upon me to actually say, I need to increase their ability to melanate. You know, that's where the solar callus blog came from. That's where the survivor soup came from. Why? Because those blogs that are on Patreon teach people how to turn on this POMC gene again. And when you turn the POMC gene on, you're actually increasing the solar panels on the outside and the inside so that you can absorb more UV light. In other words, you can provide animal photosynthesis above and below the injury. Same thing is true with the LASIK surgery, that you can actually help somebody even when they have a damaged neuropsin system. The key is, Phil, it requires the doctor to understand truly how the system is built. And you know as well as I do that not a lot of people in NHS know what I just told you. And not a lot of them are black swan mitochondriacs. I mean, I've been teaching people this, and I can tell you for sure now, 20 years later, Jack Cruz is looked at a lot less crazy than I used to be. Now people understand many of the things that I've been teaching for 20 years and how they work. And the beautiful part of this, you don't really need a doctor to understand this. You can learn it yourself, and you can learn how to use light properly. You can learn how to use diet properly to offset some of these issues. The big problem that you're going to have, and you and I have had this, I've begged you for a long time to get out of the UK. Now you understand the reason why. If he was my son, I would absolutely say, look, you need to get to the Canary Islands in the winter.
Oh, months. No. I think Jack, why he's got away with it so far, but, you know, he doesn't have any particular issues that I know of, the spine above and below. His issues are more with his skin. He lives in Bali. He's been in Thailand, and he's been in for a while, for a few years, and now he's in Bali, and he's always outside and getting loads of sun, and that's probably what's keeping him going. But his issues are more sort of with his skin. He gets a load of sort of outbreaks of like really nasty boils and stuff on his skin. He's had that for many years, and the sun doesn't seem to be doing that. But you know, I just wanted to sort of see whether, you know, what are the little hacks around that you can do when you've got all these weird things that the centralized medical system have done to us.
Well, with your son, I would actually tell him to read my Survivor Soup Patreon blog. Why? Because that'll provide some of the base chemicals that are all, how shall we say, photoactive, to get back into his skin. The number one thing that I'd be worried about, especially with boils, that tells me there's a problem with the other part of the POMC gene, which is beta and gamma MSH. Those control, that's where your problem came from. Autoimmune conditions and conditions of immunity are present there. The other big thing with skin breakouts is also the vitamin A problem. Remember that opsins all have vitamin A, and they have a weak covalent bond. So if you get too much blue light, one of the things that happens is the opsin breaks free of the vitamin A. The vitamin A then destroys all the photoreceptors in your body, anything that's heme or melanin based. So what you just told me about your son, his skin may be downregulated because of the problem with beta and gamma MSH. See, now it's not an alpha problem. Now it's these other two. That's what controls B cells and T cells. See, your wife also has that issue tied to the Graves. And most people don't even know that those other chemicals link to these problems. But what it means is the skin can become atrophic. In other words, it's not as good a semiconductor solar panel that it needs to be for the rest of the system. So when you realize that and you boost the things that are missing, the number one thing that you're usually missing when it comes to the skin and the brain, realize that the entanglement between the skin and the brain, and I mean that in a real sense, is between vitamin A and vitamin D. Vitamin A and vitamin D are coupled. They're another one of the coupled systems. People forget that from the embryo, the skin and the brain both come from neuroectoderm. So does melanin. All the POMC neurons come from the neural crest. So these things are all linked. The problem is in the adult form, the skin is far away from the brain. So what did nature do to entangle these two organs? Remember, the skin is the largest organ in humans. The brain is the Ferrari engine. It basically brought together the vitamin A and vitamin D system. And those two things are linked. So when vitamin A is freed in the system, it pushes down your vitamin D. Why? Your skin becomes atrophic. You cannot convert cholesterol to vitamin D3. So when you go to the doctor, they say, oh, look, your D3 is low. And you're like, wait a minute, this is impossible. I'm in Bali. There's no way. There is a way. And the reason why this happens is because you're freeing up too much vitamin A in the system. And what does that do? It pushes the D down. And people don't get told this enough. So people that have like vitiligo, eczema, actinic keratosis, all of those diseases that are present on the skin, like when a baby is born and has eczema and rosacea, I immediately know that baby is coming from a mother that's got a circadian mismatch epigenetically. Your son likely has the same thing. In other words, his solar panel isn't fully optimized yet. And once he gets this message, hopefully you send him the podcast, and he realizes that he probably needs to fix this, usually with not only infrared A light, like I would have him use infrared A light, but a huge amount of carotenoids. That's what actually the Survivor Suit blog post is about. It's something that you do before you build your solar callus back. Because remember, what is the solar callus idea? It's actually about melanin renovation everywhere in your body, not only your brain, but also on your skin. Because what I'm trying to do through all these blogs and through all this teaching, without teaching you all the quantum mechanics, I want you to be able to realize that you can renovate your solar panels when you understand how to do this, no matter where you live. Even if you live in a shit place like you do, you can still have an effect, on your system to help yourself. Now, it may turn out that, the 52nd latitude isn't going to work for Graves' disease. More than likely, it's probably not going to work. But are there things that you can do to try to optimize the system and then bring in, say, a reptile light, bring in infrared A light, taking more frequent trips to the Canary Islands or to Morocco, to stimulate that, or making
Jack, are those EMR tech lights good?
Well, the small little ones, they don't have enough juice for the problems that you're bringing to my table today. I would tell you that you need something that has a higher irradiance, but are there commercial lights out there that can handle, like your son's problem or handle your wife and your kid's problem? The answer is yes. For example, the light you just mentioned, I have it shining on me right now. Why? Because it's technically the sun hasn't risen yet. So anytime that I'm on the internet, I've got Iris on my computer, and I'm wearing, my blue blocking glasses from Lucia Eyes. Soon as the sun rises, then that goes off. But that works for what we're doing right now. I'm trying to offset the blue light from our interaction. Why? Because I was up all night, taking care of shit when I shouldn't have been up, but that's part of my job. And I know that entails risk to me. So I try to mitigate those risks. I'm trying to do the same thing you're trying to do for your family by asking me these questions. But the more you do right really comes from, Phil, you understanding some of the things that I'm trying to get you to understand, because it's really hard to get people to do the right thing until they know why they're doing it. And when they know why they're doing it, they're like, okay, this makes a little bit of sense now. And that's why I said you have to know a little bit of biochemistry, a little bit of biophysics, but I really don't have to teach people, the level of quantum mechanics that I know. I always famously say on podcasts, I don't have to teach lions and hippos quantum mechanics. They know what to do. I want to get, your family and your listeners to the same area. If they just are directionally accurate with respect to light, and they do the things that they can do, you can fix these problems in you. But realize that part of your melanin renovation program, part of the leptin prescription, is actually seeing the sunrise every day. Hopefully now you understand why I said that 20 years ago and why it's operational. That actually activates the retinohypothalamic tract back so that light and dark cycles become coupled, so that vitamin A and vitamin D become coupled, so that you're not down regulating your solar panels. In other words,
well, you'll be pleased to know I never miss a sunrise.
Good.
I'm always out there.
And that's kind of the key. And that's the key to upregulating the POMC gene, in your body. Now, POMC only is translated with UV light. This is the thing that people are surprised to find out when they look into it. The POMC gene is really what I would call human superpower. It's actually the basis. If you remember back when I wrote CT4 and CT6, when the paleo community's head exploded about this, and I talked about the Sherpas and I talked about being able to be superhuman, and people are like, dude, are you kidding me? I'm like, no, I'm not kidding you. It goes back to this.
You know what, Jack? When I was listening to you going on about the Sherpas in a podcast a little while ago, I was reminded of when I did the Annapurna base camp thing, back in '99, and there was a Sherpa. He was like 8 stone. What is that? I mean, I don't know, 110 pounds, and I had a friend who was 220 pounds. And he just linked arms with him and just ran up the mountain with him. It was just, they were incredible. And just little flip-flops, and all this Westerners whinging and whatever. Oh, I can't walk any further. These guys, give me another pack, and they're on. Amazing, yeah. Right.
And people don't realize, this is the arguments that I get into with like the Peter Attias, who are like the longevity experts in the United States that have their own podcasts, that tell people, well, no, you need to hypertrophy your muscles and become like a gorilla to live long. And I'm like, no. That's not where humans bury their mitochondrial density. We bury it in our brain and our heart. If you hypertrophy your muscles, you're actually not following the Sherpa pathway. You're actually following the centralized medicine idea of how to reduce glucose and insulin. Remember that this is the reason why I have a problem with the food gurus. They believe the better your muscle is, you can handle taking care of the blood glucose and the insulin. Turns out this POMC gene says, fuck you, you're wrong. Okay. And you need to understand the key is in the Sherpas. The fact that they can pick up 200-300% of their body weight and do the things that they do makes you realize that you can still be really, really strong, but you don't have to have hypertrophied muscles. You have to be really, really tan and fuel your body with saturated fats. What people don't realize, when the Sherpas are going from 20 to 25,000 feet and they're carrying all the stuff on their back, they're fueling themselves by eating pure butter. And it's all they're doing is they're filling their mitochondrial matrix with H+. That's what they're doing when it's freezing cold. When they get cold, they're closer to the sun, so the UV light's high. This is the reason why they're all tan. You'll also notice, if you've ever been to the Himalayas, like I have, these people don't wear a lot of clothes. They'll wear them when they go up higher, but at lower elevations, that's why they're all tan. And you go, wait a minute, these people are at the 24th, 25th latitude. They got better tans than people in the equator. And this is the reason why it happens. And it gets back to the original part of this podcast that I want you to understand. You have an amazing ability built into you by nature, where you can renovate the melanin sheets everywhere in your body. The problem is the Sherpas do it implicitly. You need to do it in the UK. Your son needs to do it in Bali. The point that I'm trying to make here, you could be at the right latitude, but still fuck this up if you don't understand truly how the system works. And see, that's why you always hear me tell people, get your frontal lobes out of your own way. It turns out your frontal lobes, your beliefs, your wants, needs, and desires usually trump the quantum biology built into you. The reason you never get to the Sherpa pathway, to the CT6 pathway, the leptin melanocortin home run, is because your life, your desires, your wants and needs get in the way. That is the inconvenient truth behind Jack Cruz. And that's the reason why, people like to call me a shit stirrer. I'm not a shit stirrer. I'm trying to get people to understand that the system is designed a specific way. And it turns out that the biophysics are the huge lever that control the biochemistry below. See, the problem with most of the food gurus and guys like Bart, they believe that biochemistry controls everything. The levers, every single biochemical in our body has an absorption and emission spectra, meaning that there's a certain frequency of light that activates it, and there's a certain frequency of light that deactivates it. So if you think just understanding, PEP or phosphofructokinase and glycolysis is all you need to know, you're a fucking idiot, okay? A fucking idiot. You need to understand how light controls all these things. And, I've tried in other podcasts to make this simple for people to understand. If you're not a scientist, you'll appreciate what I'm about to tell you. You open up a biochemistry book and you look at the glycolytic pathway and you say, God, why is all these goddamn enzymes here? There's 8 or 9 different ones. Fast forward, TLDR, simple. Photosynthesis is trying to make sure that you get H+ in your matrix. Why? Because you run a hydrogen engine. That's why they're all there. You don't need to know anything else that the food gurus want to teach you about all these things, because they're fucking immaterial, okay? Just know that the biophysics built into you, this is the reason why it's there. H+ is the fuel source of the matrix, okay? That's what spins the ATPase. Turns out the current that comes through, that's the light you get from the sun. That creates the electromagnetic nanotorque engine that really is your ATPase. End of report. You don't need to know anything more than that, okay? If you continue to optimize that system by utilizing, the light environment, you can stay away from guys like me for a really long time. The issue becomes what Phil has brought to this podcast. Well, what happens when I get Graves' disease? What happens when I got an aneurysmal bone cyst in my neck and I've got to have all this shit done in my neck so that I'm not paralyzed? Those are levels of complexity where, guess what? You're going to have to sit down with Uncle Jack and I'm going to have to explain some of this to you. In other words, you're going to have to do things differently than other people. It's very, very apropos using a cruise ship. If you're on a cruise ship and everything's going great, you don't have to worry about it. But if you hit a fucking iceberg, you better get in the boat to get out so you don't die, okay? That's really what happens when someone develops a mitochondrial disease, where they have to do things differently than other people in their house. So trying to bring this full circle back to the original question you asked me, your job, Phil, needs to be with those children, knowing that they're little melanated mammals more than you. You have to always teach them how to renovate melanin. And it turns out the story of renovating melanin is a story of UV light and one other thing that I know you know well, but you don't realize how it connects to this story. Oxygenation of hemoglobin. Turns out the more that their hemoglobin stays in the +3 state, the oxidation state, the more they'll deliver oxygen to melanin. Melanin's real goal in your body, it's the ultimate charge separator of water. Now, going back on some other podcasts that you and I have talked about, I told you the first step in photosynthesis that creates all food, the number one thing that has to happen is you have to charge separate water into hydrogen, oxygen, and 2 electrons. That is the key, okay? Guess what melanin does? It's more efficient than chlorophyll at doing just that. And the way it stays efficient is when hemoglobin can deliver huge amounts of oxygen to that area. So you may be shocked to hear this, because this ties back to your wife's story. In the part of her retina that I told you to get an OCT, there's an area that uses the most oxygen in the human body, okay? It's called the choriocapillaris. It uses 80% FiO2. Like if I gave you that through an endotracheal tube, you would develop organ system failure. But guess what? Your retina is built, especially right where the retinal hypothalamic tract begins, where those blue light detectors are, to actually use this oxygen. And the reason why is because it renovates the melanin in the RPE of the eye tremendously. Well, what's the message here for your kids? Every time you put them in front of an iPhone, an iPad, or this computer to listen to this podcast, you are decreasing the amount of oxygen. Not only are you dehydrating them, but oxygen tensions drop. So guess what happens, Phil? When oxygen tensions drop, their melanin renovation program goes in the shitter. Okay? In other words, they're not living like the monk who sold his Ferrari. They're doing exactly the opposite. That is the key part of the story.
No, that's brilliant, man. Thank you so much. There's something I'd love to get your take on, which is, I like my group's called Carnivore and Beyond. And people go, so I think it's funny when people get on there and they're going, this is a carnivore group, you shouldn't be talking about the other stuff. And I'm going like, listen, the and beyond is all the other stuff, I mean, I find people who go carnivore, sometimes they get great results, but the ones who get the great results are the ones who also sort out their circadian rhythm, also get everything else into place, and then everything all works together. But recently, there has been a huge, everybody sort of blames it on one thing. Any issues they'll blame on one thing. The latest thing everybody's focusing on is oxalates. And it's like everything's down to oxalates and oxalate dumping. And to be honest, I find it a very interesting rabbit hole. I've been down it, when I made my stupid mistake of tons of spinach smoothies back in 2011 or so. Soon after that, I got a kidney stone. But puzzlingly, last year, I got a kidney stone. I thought, where did that come from? And was it true that you can actually store these things and dump them, years afterwards? Now, everybody's black. And also I had a load of other symptoms while I was sick in those 3 months of last year that sort of tallied in with oxalate dumping, which they call it. However, I look at this sort of stuff, and because I'm not my background is in sort of yoga and meditation, all that spirituality stuff. I'm not a great diet guru, to be honest. It's so weird to me that I've even been considered one, I thought I'd end up being some kind of a non-dual teacher or something, but now I look down that rabbit hole and I think some things are not adding up. Like, for example, the body can make endogenous oxalates, and nature doesn't make a mistake. What I love about all your work is that you look at nature and then try and explain that, instead of making up some shitty hypothesis and trying to push that through like most scientism type people do. And so what is your take on this? Because everybody's obsessed with it. You're going, oh, no, some people go, no, it's not a problem at all. No, oxalates are building up. You can dump them years afterwards. Oh, they're not a problem. Oh, yeah, they are a problem. What's going on with this oxalate fixation in the carnivore group? I'd love to have them see a completely different perspective that wasn't to do with diet or whatever. I've heard you link it to thiamine. I've seen Elliot Overton link it to thiamine.
You know how thiamine links to this, though?
Away you go.
Just think about what we said. Thiamine is the cofactor that gets acetyl-CoA into the matrix, okay? So basically, everything I just told you about oxygen is the key. Anytime you're pseudohypoxic, you have a problem with thiamine. In fact, if you go read my Patreon blog, it's called Hypoxia 1. It's actually about this story. So anytime oxygen is decreased, you're going to have a problem with thiamine, and you're going to wind up with an oxalate problem. What's the ultimate cause of this? A lack of melanin in your body. In other words, POMC's been turned off. So guess what? It is a light story. And it turns out the real issue with oxalate problems is because there's a lack of electrons, meaning in the semiconductive circuits in your body, you don't have enough electrons in the system. So what happens? The oxalates begin to rise, and that's how you get it. How can you fix this? Just get people back in the sun, tighten up their circadian biology. I mean, it's not that hard to understand. The problem is, just as you said, when you're not a scientist and you don't understand how, like when I look at mitochondria, I look at oxygen is the terminal electron acceptor. Remember, the input is at NADH, NAD positive. So this is the wiring diagram. You need to understand from my left hand to my right hand what happens. Well, proximal to the left hand is the thymine story. That's how you get acetyl-CoA in as a ferry boat. When oxygen drops, thymines immediately a problem. So the reason I wrote the first Patreon blog in the hypoxia series about this is for people to always make that link. Hopefully, people now understand what is really the evolutionary biology of POMC. It's to charge separate water to create hydrogen, oxygen, and what? 2 electrons. Why is this important for you to understand? What's the difference about humans compared to every other mammal? We don't make any vitamin C endogenously. Do you know why? What does vitamin C do? Let's go back to your wife story. Phenylalanine to tyrosine to T3 to T4 to TSH, all of that stuff. You know what it uses? BH4, which is 2 endogenous electrons. Vitamin C gives 2 electrons exogenously. You need that to run every hydroxylase pathway in you. But guess what? Nature says we don't have the glucogene anymore that makes vitamin C. So why is that the case? It's because we fucking elevated melanin in humans tremendously. Why? Because it creates more electrons than anything else in your body. So Phil, when your melanin needs to be renovated, what does that mean? You lack electrons. How do you absorb light, Phil? Remember the guy, 1922, funny hair, mustache, won a Nobel Prize, photoelectric effect? You can't absorb light without electrons. So when you develop an oxalate problem on a carnivore diet, what does it tell you? Your diet's fine, but you need to go on a tech diet. You need to go on a tech diet and you need to get more solar stuff back to get UV light to turn POMC on, because POMC through alpha MSH is how you create the free electrons from charge separating water. Most people don't even know this. When you get this problem with oxalates and you have kidney stones, you're making more reactive oxygen species in your kidney, your ureters, and everything else. Do you know what ROS does with melanin? Melanin absorbs ROS. It takes every single free radical has an unpaired electron. Melanin is designed not only to charge separate water and create electrons, it takes its ROS and makes free electrons. It's fucking our superhuman ability. So the key is you need to understand everything you possibly can about this leptin melanocortin pathway. When you lose melanin in your ureters, when you lose melanin in your adrenal gland that sits on top of your kidney and in your kidney, you are set up for oxalate stones. I mean, it is not even close. I don't give a shit if you eat a Fred Flintstone tomahawk steak every day. It will not matter. And I guarantee you, the people that get this, they usually have pale atrophic skin. And even if you're dark, say like some of your family, I always go to African Americans in the United States. I said, tell me what happens when you go out in the sun. Well, I get sunburned just like you do. I said, well, you're not supposed to. The fact that you are getting it tells me melanin renovation is a problem. And they're stunned. They're stunned when they hear it. I'm like, look, if you can't tolerate the sun when you're out and you got brown skin, dude, you got a bigger problem than a white guy that doesn't have it. That's where the oxalate problem comes from. It's a lack of electrons, okay? So again, Phil, it's not the biochemistry, my friend. We're back to the biophysics.
Mm. Yeah, brilliant. And definitely, you know, last year I had far too much screen time. I had a whole load of things that I wanted to do. Well, I didn't want to do them, but I was having to do on the screen much more than I usually do. And yeah, I was getting out and playing a load of festivals. Every time the sun came out, I'd go out there. But yeah, I was not on as much of a tech diet as I usually am. And yeah, that definitely ties in. Yeah, Jack, I've got one more thing I'd like to get into with you. It's just a weird question for you, really. Well, probably not for you, but it's something I've not heard you talk about too much. Now it's years and years since I read The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari, but I do suspect that there was a load of stuff about consciousness in there, as far as I remember.
Mhm.
What is your opinion on I mean, we've got light, we've got emotions, we got all of these things that add up to health or ill health and mitochondrial disruption as the body gets stressed. Levels of consciousness and stuff. What do you think of things like these sort of spontaneous remissions? Now, I think it's a stupid term because nothing is ever spontaneous. There's always something that causes it. But like these amazing stories like you get with sort of Joe Dispenza and things like that, I don't know how many of those are genuine, but incredible stories like, for example, Anita Moorjani, who was utterly riddled with cancer. They were collecting everybody by the bed. She was just, days from dying. She did die and she came back. And, the tumors disappeared. And a lot of people who seem to have these near-death experiences seem to have these shifts in consciousness. How would you tie that into? Oh, and I also heard somebody the other day going on about that who said, actually, I was thinking of you when she was saying it, actually, but she said, what actually healed me was I was in some other sort of dimension, and what was healing me was light pouring through, And I thought, well, what do you think about these things where things just go bang and suddenly clear up? Is there something that trumps light? Is there something in consciousness? What's going on there? That's what I'd love to hear your take.
I've told my members, they've asked me a lot of these questions over the 15 years that I do webinars every month for them. And I did one on spirituality. I did another one on this issue you're bringing up. Light has amazing capabilities. You go back and listen to some of my Vermont videos. I tell people light is timeless. Photons are timeless. When they hit matter, that's when time becomes an issue. And it turns out that consciousness, or I would like to say intuition, I use these almost interchangeable when I talk to people. Consciousness is a function of mitochondrial redox. How can I prove that to you axiomatically that I'm right? I could take you right now, Phil, and put a tube down your throat, introduce the general anesthetic, and I can make your DC electric current in your brain go away. I can actually reverse that process and bring you back. You went from conscious to unconscious, and I can do it to you. Now, the interesting part is the anesthesiologist has no clue actually how this works. I kind of do. But the point I'm trying to make to you, I want you to think about consciousness in terms of the ability to create electricity from light. So that's where it links to the stories that these people report, that they notice that somehow light is tied to this. Melanin is the chemical that actually turns sunlight into the DC electric current in mammals. It turns out humans have more of it than any other primate and than any other mammal. Any mammal that's encephalized tremendously, like dolphins, whales, us, we have huge amounts of melanin inside of us, okay? The second thing is intuition also comes from there. But here's where the story gets interesting. One of the things I tried to tell you before about your wife, tyrosine, phenylalanine, T3, T4, what's the other thing at the end that happens in the hypothalamus and the thalamus? Makes a key amino acid called L-DOPA. You probably heard about that from Parkinson's disease because we make synthetic L-DOPA analogs. What people don't realize, L-DOPA in the human body is also an amino acid, but it can be transformed to dopamine, noradrenaline, and to several other chemicals that we need. Those are the chemicals that will lead to the transformation, the conscious awareness that you have. When those chemicals are altered, what I like to try to explain to people, I have a good friend who you probably know, Rick Rubin, wrote a book about creativity. And I told him his new book basically is a story of the human frontal lobes that go from here to here. It's like, I like to think of it as a bowling alley. The two gutters, this one's depression, this one is schizophrenia. Everything in between are Rick's clients, in the music business. And that's where their creativity comes from. But low dopamine is the depression state. High dopamine, but chaotic release is schizophrenia. And this ties right back to your ability to make dopa in your system. When you recover the ability to actually make this creation, intuition, consciousness improves. Like, you and I right now are conscious. I would submit to you that some of the people that you hang out with in the UK, you know that you have a bigger connection with them than other friends. I'm going to tell you, you have a more conscious awareness with those people. This stuns people when I tell them, because I like to use the term low dopamine and high dopamine interchangeably to try to make this point. Consciousness also is a relative thing. Just like Einstein taught us a long time ago, everything is relative, not just time, but so is consciousness. And I believe consciousness is a function of how animal photosynthesis occurs between light and melanin to create the electric current in our body. That's how I look at it. And what brought me to this is actually being a surgeon. Every time I put someone to sleep to be able to operate on them, I'm always stunned about, A, that we can do this. But the thing that's the most interesting thing to me, this is what makes me unusual for a surgeon, I will stay in the room until my patient awakes. And one of the things that I've noticed over 20 years is that not everybody awakes at the same rate. And it turns out the people that emerge longer usually have lower redox. They have bigger problems. For example, your son's problem. When you operate on a kid like that, they're usually going to emerge like this. But if I do the same surgery that your son had on, say, somebody who has mild dementia, it will take them literally 6 to 8, sometimes 24 hours to be completely back to their normal self. And the reason for that is they have a decreased ability to turn light back in to the DC electric current. One of the things that I started to change, I'm going to tell you, was probably 7, 8 years ago. I couldn't do it earlier because I couldn't get the hospitals to agree. I would recover my patients in the sun. I'd make the nurses bring them out into the sun. And obviously we couldn't do this for, big brain surgeries and things like that because you had a bunch of machines. But in people that had like the type of surgery your son did, well, what I found is I was able to get them through anesthesia better when I was able to put them back in the sun. In other words, it was much more able to change consciousness and change intuition faster. I found that the more I got people in the sun pre and post-op, the more they actually paid attention to their disease. In other words, they listened to me better. And when I say listen to me better, I'm trying to explain to you, this is a conscious connection, meaning our connection is better than it would be if it wasn't there. And the interesting thing is, I don't know if you've ever read Roland Van Wyck's book. If you haven't, you need to, about light sculpting life. We emit extreme low frequency UV light when we have conversations. When we met in London, what went down and how I told you I want to pull you up on the stage. And I wanted you to actually affect the audience members. You did not understand why I was adamant about this. I said, Phil, you can tell your story all you want. I need them to see you tell your story, because I knew you telling your story over this medium that we have now, just like I'm telling you the story about what happened in the monk who sold his Ferrari, it's not going to have as big an effect. In other words, you are not consciously going to get punched in the mouth by this story as much as you will with Phil Escott being on the stage, in the UK, telling you what happened, especially with Jeremy Tomley next to you, especially with Jack Cruz there. In other words, they are getting hit with a spectrum of light as you speak. As your brain functions for you to tell the story, you're emitting light. This is information that they are capable of assimilating if their melanin sheets are working. You didn't hit everybody properly in the UK, not because of your fault, because your audience, everybody had different ability to perform animal photosynthesis. So what am I saying to you? The people, the stories that you talk about, the meditation, the spirituality, how people are moved by certain music and not. This is all a function of how much light we emit and how much light we absorb. That's the way I look at it.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's spot on. Yeah, it was funny you say about taking people out in the sun and people coming around quicker and whatever. And they used to do that with the TB patients, didn't they? They'd take them out in the sun and whatever. They don't do that anymore, but to anybody. But it was funny, Tom, when he woke up from the operation, because he had two. He had one from the back, and then a week later he had one from the front. It was the most hideous week in hospital. Just awful memories of that. But after his second operation, he came out, and I thought he was completely out. He came out with a picture of it actually opened and the plate in there like stuck on his chest when they'd taken a picture for me. I thought, oh, wow, okay. And he was lying there, and I thought, he's not going to come around for hours and whatever. And he was like that. And suddenly I heard him say something, and I leant in. There was a nurse, a male nurse, sort of taking care of people in the recovery room. And he had this huge eyebrow, right? One of those single ones.
Unibrow.
Yeah, Tom, and I leaned in, and Tom, I didn't even know he'd opened his eyes yet. And I leaned in, and he just went, Dad, look at that dude's monobrow. I thought he's going to be okay. He's cool.
Mm-hmm. But these are interesting things to talk about, because you realize, what people just experienced through that story is you knew immediately your son was going to be okay, because you realized his cognitive functioning this soon after the surgery, for him to pick up that little nuance.
Yeah.
It told you something. See, that's the crazy thing, Phil, that there's a whole paragraph that is written in between those words. Like, you did not have to be told by any doctor that your son was going to be okay. You knew in that moment. And the reason why is because he's your son. You are entangled to him physically and spiritually. And the thing is, the force carrier of entanglement is the photon. And that's the part, I'm that guy that can explain that kind of connection to you. It's the reason I want to explain how all these little boxcars in biochemistry work. It's the same process. When you ask me the question you just asked me, it doesn't bother me at all. What really bothers me? There's going to be people listening to this that don't realize that there's hardcore science published in the literature that proves all of this. You know what the problem is? Scientists in ivory towers, in the NHS, in the University of Surrey, in UCL in London, they're not connecting these dots for you. They're not connecting these dots for your family. They're not connecting the dots. I mean, we spend all this money on research. You would think you want to make that research useful by connecting it back to the fabric of nature that is the lives that we live. That is the source of my pain. That is the source of my anger. It is the source when you hear me, write something on social media and go, ooh, that was spicy. That's where it comes from. I want people to know that these processes are in us, and we need to get out of our own way to realize this. That's, to me, the beautiful part of your story about the unibrow. You could write a whole chapter. You probably immediately felt better about what your son just went through. You just said that whole week in the hospital was horrible. I know what that surgery is all about. But what you said, you answered your own question. You didn't even realize you answered your own question. When you asked me the question about consciousness and spirituality and intuition, where it comes from. That's where it comes from. It's actually light, water, and magnetism fundamentally operating at a level below your perception. But I know you got it because the message from your son to you absolutely punched you in the mouth. No one had to tell Phil that, things were not going to go awry. You knew things were good. The funny thing is, when you tell me a story like that, the reason why it resonates with me so strongly, and the reason I'm spending time on this, the flip side happens to me a lot. For example, I'm going to have to leave you soon. Unfortunate story. I have somebody I have to go pronounce brain dead later today. And, it's a bad story of a mother that just had, a baby 4 months ago. And the baby, they were in a bad car accident. And the baby fractured her skull on a certain side of the head. So did mom. Mom's injury worse than the baby. The baby's going to be fine. But I had to make a decision last night whether to operate or not. And here's the flip side. I knew immediately, as soon as I looked at the CT scan, and as soon as I examined her, especially in her eyes and her skull, I said, this person's not going to live. I knew it just like you knew your son with his unibrow comet. And it's very, very hard to get this emotion out because I had to translate what I knew immediately, not only from my experience, but what I felt right away, that if I operated on this person, I was doing a disservice to the family. I was doing a disservice to her mother and father. I was doing a disservice to the baby. Why? I would have created a huge medical bill. I would have created somebody who probably was veg, probably still wouldn't have lived. But then I have to be able to sit down in an emergency room and explain that to a mother and father of that mother. And that's the flip side of this. That's why I said it's once you understand this process, and I'm going to tell you this, understanding doesn't change the emotions that go with it. In fact, I will tell you, it deepens the emotions. It makes you realize truly how connected you are to nature. And I think the more you go down this rabbit hole, I think the easier it becomes to try to do podcasts like this, to try to get your patients to understand this. It is very, very difficult for me to have conversations with certain people. I will tell you, people who mean something to me, people who are close in my family, when I know implicitly, just like you knew that your son was going to be okay, but that they're not going to be okay, therein lies a big problem. And I will tell you, does it affect the relationship that you're going to have between those two mammals? I'm going to tell you that it does. And the thing is, that's when people say that's when it changes. I always tell people when I have members, they come and go. Just do me a favor. Don't stand in the doorway because there's a lot of traffic. It's a comment that puts a lot of people off, but it's also a comment that puts a lot of people on, because what I want people to know is that there's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of unibrow stories out there, more than the ones I just told you on the flip side. But we need to be cognizant of truly how we work, because the stuff that we're talking about now with disease, this happens in our lives. You started this podcast off asking me, Jack, talk to my kids, talk to my wife. Why? I know why. I know it was exactly the same thing that you just told me about your son. You're worried about them, and you're hoping that something that we talk about today, because you've been ineffective at affecting their behavior, that if they hear it from somebody else who's an authority, figure, maybe, the message will resonate. I'm going to tell you, I don't know if that's the case, but I will tell you this. Keep doing what you're doing, because it tells me that you care. It also tells me that when you put this out for the public to see it, that authenticity also is going to resonate. You're not going to have to talk about it. I'm talking about it. I'm telling your audience what you're really up to. I get it. See, this is the stuff that happens between the words. This is the stuff that really life is all about. This is the stuff that the biochemistry can't explain, but the light can.
You know something, Jack, I've got to put that back to you as well and say that, I always chuckle when I see you sort of making these statements on social media and whatever that upset people, because I'm just chuckling because I know your heart. I mean, you've shown it there. I think it's beautiful. And I've seen it, I saw it, I read between many lines when we had that evening, in that oyster restaurant, and then we went up onto the roof. And there was a sort of magical moment there where there were these sort of tottering secretaries, and they were there in their high heels and they'd come out for some drinks. And there you were talking to them about all this kind of stuff. And they were mesmerized. And normally, if anybody talks about anything serious to somebody like that, I might be judging them a bit, but they probably wouldn't have any kind of focus on it. But I don't know whether you noticed that I noticed that, but I was watching that and I thought that was just such a great moment, and I know your heart, I can see it. And I know that you have just such a beautiful wish for humanity to understand all this stuff and to understand the bullshit that's gone before. And I really appreciate you for that. And thank you so much for your time. And I won't take up any more today. Maybe we can do another one. So I've not even scratched the surface of the questions, but that's the way it goes. And it's been beautiful. Thank you. And listen, before we go, let everybody know, probably everybody who's watching this knows you anyway, to be honest. But if there's some new people out there, how can they follow more of your work, and what are you up to there at the Cruz Longevity Center and whatever? Tell them what you're up to, how they can find you now, the best ways.
Probably the simple thing is Dr. Jack Cruz, pretty much on every platform. Put it in a Google box, you'll find me. If you have a disease, you want to know a little bit more about it, put the name of the disease, my name in a Google box, hit the button, you'll probably find something. If you want to come to the forum and see, there's 20 years of quantum biology information for free on the forums. Go to jackcruz.com, go straight to the forums, start reading it. You'll notice the forums are broken down. If you want more focused, split your head open information about quantum biology, Patreon, just go patreon.com/Dr. Jack Cruz. I've got a book. Phil knows about that. It's on Amazon. I've probably got close to 500-600 podcasts that are out there, all free. Look them up. Some of them are better than others. And then the one-on-one time, you can find me. If you decide you want to become a member, you become a member of my site, you go info@jackcruz.com, or I should say info@cruz@destin.com. Then you'll be able to participate with me. I do Q&As every month. The Q&As lately have been 4 to 6 hours. I do one every month where you can ask me questions directly about very specific topics. I don't shy away from those on member Q&As. If it's really personal and it's really tied to your N=1, I'll probably tell you to do a consult. You can hire me to do, be your decentralized doctor. But at the Cruz Longevity Center, that's when it's mano a mano, you and me. It's expensive, I'm not gonna lie to you, but you get the full force of Jack Cruz. It's like a fire hydrant on your own biologic problems. And
you know what? When you were speaking to those girls up on top of that roof, Jeremy was there, Jeremy Tomley, and he said to me, he said, he's like a tidal wave in a kiddie pool. I just spent
a week with Jeremy.
It was his birthday, wasn't it?
Yeah, his birthday was yesterday.
Yeah, yesterday. What a lovely guy. That was the first time I'd met him, and you came over to England with him. And you
Well,
just
I
fall in
told you
love with him straight away, don't you? He's so lovely.
I made sure that you entangled them. Just think about that time we met and kind of what happened, and think about what we just talked about for the last hour and a half. There was a reason that I was pulling you up on the stage with Jeremy. You and Jeremy have part of the story to talk about. He's got the fatal disease, and you had the disease you reversed. And my profession told me he was going to die. And guess what? He's 40 years old and he still looks like freaking Michelangelo's Adonis.
Yeah, it looks great.
And you know, you're still alive and kicking, even though you fucking won't listen to me and you keep living in the UK. But the whole point is to get the people that were in the audience in 2015. And, you know, there's been some collateral things that have happened from that event. Like, from that event, believe it or not, I don't even know if you know this, Phil, the guy who got me to come to the UK, Jamie Ward, who collapsed on stage because he couldn't give his talk, he wound up totally changing his life, marrying the girl of his dreams, partially because of that trip. And I was the one that put them together. I flew back to the UK for their wedding. I guess it was probably a year or two later. And I often think about that day that I said to you, get your ass down here. I don't care how long it's going to take for you to come. You're like, Jack, I don't have any money to buy a ticket. I said, you don't need the money to buy a ticket. You're coming on the stage with me. And you were like, I don't know if I can do this. You can do it. You need to punch these people in the mouth about your story. And I said, you need to be on the stage with Jeremy. And, you know, you have not seen Jeremy or me physically since that time. Many of the things that you talked about in this podcast actually happened to you that day on the stage. And you don't realize that you and Jeremy punched those people in the mouth. You had huge effects. Without you being on that stage, Phil, I don't know if Jamie Ward and his future bride ever come to be. I don't even know if you know that Jamie's family was there. They're the ones that paid for this event to go on. They're the ones that, Jack, if you think Phil needs to be up there, you go for it. We trust you implicitly. Like, this is their event. Think about it, Phil. And here we are now, almost 10 years later, doing a podcast, and we're talking about this. Isn't this very much similar to the story of the unibrow with your son? The things that you didn't know, but now you kind of know.
Yeah.
That's what this is about. It's about getting mammals together and making sure that they understand really how they're built in nature. And if I can get those mammals back out in nature and be directionally accurate and see nature truly how she is and get you to copy it, then I've done my job.
That is brilliant. That's where I'm going to end this one, man. That is perfect. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
All right, Phil.
And you
take care. I got to go to work now.
Yeah. I'm just gonna stop recording there. And Jack, thank you so much.
All right, no problem. Anytime, my friend.
Son of a lighthouse keeper, through cons and a wishing